Hello, this is the second episode in a series of presentations that I will be making on the European Union, what it is and how it works. This episode is about the economy of the EU, and this part is about trade within the EU. If you haven't watched the first part of this episode yet, then please do, as it explains a lot of things about customs unions that will be relevant to this part. This part will consider three things: how UK jobs are linked to EU trade, how trade agreements work, and how much economic power the UK and the rest of the EU have in relation to each other. In this part, I will be focusing on trade between the UK and the rest of the EU. This is important as, in order to make an informed decision on the EU, we will need to work out what the effect on trade will be if the UK leaves. Let's start by looking at jobs. The first of the commonly made statements about the EU that we will be talking about in this episode is that lots of UK jobs are linked to the EU, and that if we leave the EU, then the UK risks losing those jobs. The usual figure put forward as part of this claim is around 3 million jobs. This figure comes from the Office for National Statistics. They calculated it by working out the UK's exports to the EU as a proportion of our GDP and multiplying that by the number of the jobs in the UK. In other words, it is an estimate based on the relation between various economic figures. It is not the case that someone went through all jobs in the UK, or even a sample of those jobs, and divided them into those that are linked to the EU and those that aren't. The reason that this wasn't done is that such a count would be impossible, since the various parts of the economy are so interconnected that such a division would be nonsensical. So the question here is, are those jobs at risk? And if so, by how much? To answer that, let's think about the motivation of the businesses providing those jobs. By and large, businesses like trade agreements and customs unions. There are two main reasons for this. Firstly, these arrangements provide stability. By preventing tariffs from being raised, businesses can trade with other businesses or consumers in other countries, knowing that tariffs won't suddenly spring up as a result of a political row between those two countries. This stability allows them to plan for the future and not keep too much money tied up for a rainy day. The second advantage for businesses is that customs unions and trade agreements allow access to bigger markets by lowering barriers to trade between countries, thus allowing people of one country to buy the goods and services just as freely as people of another country. Taking those two things into account, let's consider the UK again. Clearly, there are advantages to businesses to stay in the UK beyond just its membership of the EU. However, EU membership is certainly an advantage. If you take that away, then the UK becomes less attractive to businesses. However, it is difficult to say how much less attractive, and thus how many jobs would be lost. My thoughts about the first statement is thus inconclusive. Moving on, let's look at trade agreements more generally. A trade agreement is signed between two countries to allow for greater levels of trade between those two countries. Without a trade agreement, the two countries may put up tariffs to make it more expensive for businesses or consumers to buy goods or services from businesses or consumers in the other country. As a member of the EU, the UK does not currently need a trade agreement with other EU countries, but we would do so if we left the EU and didn't join any other organisations that have access to the single market, such as the European Economic Area. The UK currently has many trade agreements with other countries in the world because it is a member of the EU, and the EU has signed such trade agreements. Once again, if the UK left the EU, then it would need to negotiate trade agreements with the rest of the world to replace these agreements. Now, it is fairly likely that the countries of the EU and other countries would be willing to negotiate such agreements, as the UK is a significant economic power. However, it takes a long time to negotiate such treaties. During this time, the UK would be vulnerable to tariffs being imposed on its imports or exports. Now let's look at trade between the UK and the rest of the EU in more detail. The UK gets roughly half of its imports from the rest of the EU. This represents about 16% of the rest of the EU's exports of goods. Comparable figures are not available for services. The UK would be the EU's single biggest export markets for goods if it left. Going the other way, the figure for UK exports to the EU is more variable. It has moved between roughly 38 and 49% recently. The UK exports a smaller percentage of its goods and services to the rest of the EU than any other EU country except Malta. As a brief aside, let's consider something that often gets brought up in debates over UK trade with the rest of the EU, the Rotterdam effect. This is the theory that the UK's trade with the rest of the EU is actually smaller than it seems, as imports from other parts of the world get counted as imports from the rest of the EU because the boats that those imports travel on stop off at Rotterdam first before coming to the UK. However, even if you exclude all trade that the UK has with the Netherlands, even the things that are genuinely being imported or exported to the Netherlands, it still only reduces the UK's import-export percentages to the rest of the EU by about 6%. Even without this effect, the EU is still a significant trading market for the UK. So now let us turn to our final question, which is the second commonly made statement about the EU that we will be looking at in this episode. In trade terms, does the UK need the rest of the EU more than the rest of the EU needs the UK, or is it the other way around? First, let's ask, why is this question important? The reason we need to ask this is that if the UK were to leave the EU, we would obviously want to continue trading with the EU with minimal disruption, so as to safeguard jobs, cheap imports, and a good export market. In order to do this, the UK would want a trade agreement with the EU and quickly. If the EU's need for the UK is greater, then this should be reasonably easy. However, if the UK's need for the EU is greater, then this may be more difficult. Now, on the face of it, the UK looks to be in a reasonably strong position. If we left the EU, then we would be their single largest export market for goods, and our trade isn't as dependent on internal EU trade as many other EU countries. However, there are two important points to consider against this position. These 2 points are relative size and what the political atmosphere would be post-Brexit. Both of these points are my speculative opinion about what would happen if the UK left the EU. Even though the UK would be a significant trading partner for the EU if it left, the rest of the EU is still much larger than the UK. The rest of the EU's import-export percentages to the UK are between 10 and 20%, whereas the UK's import-export percentages to the rest of the EU are usually between 40 and 50%. That means that while losing free access to the UK market would be a financial problem for the EU, it would be a potential body blow to the UK to lose free access to the EU market. If 40% of our imports or exports were suddenly subjected to tariffs, many businesses could find it too expensive to do business between the UK and the EU, resulting in shrinking markets and even closure of some businesses. I stress that this is speculation, as no one really knows what happens when an EU member state leaves the EU, but from size alone, my opinion is that the EU is in the stronger financial position. The second problem is that the EU's attitude to the UK if we left would be quite sour. Although pragmatically it would be in the EU's interests to negotiate a trade deal with the UK as quickly as possible, the EU's mood after the UK left would be anything but pragmatic. As will be seen when we look at the euro in the next part of this episode, the EU has a record of not acting in its own financial best interest when high-profile political decisions are being taken. There would most likely be a push to punish the UK for leaving in order to discourage other countries from following the UK's lead. This would lead to the EU delaying signing trade agreements with the UK so that it could point to it as an example for others not to follow. Taking both of these into account, I would say that the UK's need for the rest of the EU is greater than the other way around, though the EU would still be hurt by a Brexit and subsequent diplomatic cold shouldering. And that's the end of this part of this episode. Join me next time when I'll be discussing UK contributions to the EU and the problems of the Eurozone.